Thank you. And thank you, Ninian and John and Joanna and everyone. I'm totally honored to be here on the stage. I'll do a quick introduction of myself, and I think I've got an hour to use. I'll try to cover my content in maybe 40 minutes or thereabouts and have as much time as possible for engagement. I always prefer to have interaction when possible. And I think I can see the slides. Okay, great. So my name is Dan Kittredge. I'm from the States. You may be able to discern that from my accent. I grew up on an organic farm, which you can see a drone shot of here. It's in central Massachusetts, which is in the northeast corner of the country. My parents were what they call back to the landers, which is effectively people who had professional credentials and careers in the city, and then realized that that life was not what they were looking for, and returned to a more simple life. So they effectively bought a piece of land on a dirt road and built a passive solar house with a root cellar and a wood stove and milk cow and a couple kids, or 4 of us actually, and started homesteading. They, like a lot of farmers, weren't able to make a living. They had been community organizers prior to that, and so they effectively started an organization called NOFA, Northeast Organic Farming Association. They started the Massachusetts chapter. This was back in the early 80s, the beginning of the organic movement, and their career was in effectively running the organic movement in New England for about 30, 35 years. Helped write some of the first organic standards, ran the annual summer conference, edited the journal of the 7-state organization. So I come as a background both as a farmer, but also in the movement. After a bit of what do they say in Australia? Walkabout for my early 20s. I would work on the farm in the summer and travel the world in the winter. I ended up, finally getting married, and when I got married and felt a need to actually be more responsible and pay some real bills as opposed to $7 an hour, 20 hours a week, 6 months of the year, which is what I was living on, which was quite fine if you've got a backpack and not much else. I had no real other viable skills besides farming, and so I thought I would set about being a farmer. I thought there was no other better way of raising children, I thought, than on the land, in community with family, et cetera, et cetera. At that point, I rapidly realized that I was entirely unfit for making a living because I, like a lot of other farmers, struggled with yield, pest pressure, disease pressure, things of that sort. I'd been brought up in the organic orthodoxy with a complete confidence that we were superior people. And it was only when I began to think about the fact that being eaten alive by a flesh-eating fungus, if you were a cow, would be a sign of poor health. If you're a zucchini squash, is also a sign of poor health. If you're being eaten alive by larvae as a chicken, that's a sign of poor health. If you're being eaten alive by larvae as a potato plant, that's also a sign of poor health. It's only when I put A and B together and realized that my plants weren't healthy, and that's probably why I was not able to make a living, that I was able to step into a place of a bit more humility, driven by the fact that I also had a family and bills I needed to pay. And so I set about doing a bit of research, started reading books, going to conferences, attending seminars. There was an organization, or actually a company, a group called Acres USA, which had been founded in the early 70s by Charles Walters, which is where I found a bunch of really profound integrated wisdom, taking insights from the biodynamic community, from the permaculture community, from agroecology, from conventional ag, IPM, organic, quantum, really a very big tent. It was there that I, really sort of began to understand that we actually do have the science to understand how to work with nature, and heard about this thing called brix. I'm not sure if anybody's heard about brix. Refractometer, an instrument that's been around for almost 200 years. That is a very simple way of discerning relative plant health, and also a way of measuring relative nutritional value. I had actually started off this quest, in an attempt to write an article for my father's newspaper, the Journal of NOFA, called The Natural Farmer. He was doing a quarterly. It's a quarterly journal, and the theme that quarter was, "Is organic better?" And, the sort of presumption amongst organic people was that our crops were more nutritious, and I was, proposing to unposit that question, as Fichte would say, and asked, what is better than organic? So when I came across brix and refractometers, and I was like, oh my God, there's a metric, there's an instrument, there's a tool, there's numbers, we can measure this kind of thing. I got very, very excited. And as I began to proceed through the years in this understanding, one of the basic questions was, what's this word for the variation in nutrient levels in food? Is there a way to measure that? Is there a way to assess that? Because isn't that really the point? Isn't actually the nutritional value of the food the point? Just because you're certified organic, or you're local, or you're now regenerative as a buzzword, or permaculture, or whatever the identity is. We had slow food. There's all these sort of ebbs and flows that have come in the movement. Isn't really the nutritional value of the food the point? At least for the general public. And if it is true that, as it seems, that higher brix readings correlate with soil health, farm viability, pest resistance, disease resistance, flavor, aroma, shelf life, wouldn't it be exciting to engage a deeper conversation around that topic and potentially build a big tent through which we could find allyship across these different streams of the movement? If people are familiar with the biodynamic community and the permaculture community and the agroecological community and the organic community and the now regenerative community, actually these are really just words for the same thing. These are like, you're a Presbyterian, or you're a Methodist, or you're a an evangelical. Like, basically you all agree that Christ was a pretty cool dude, right? So can we find some common ground? Anyway, we at that, early on there, probably 06, 07, 08, created this term nutrient density to refer to this conversation, because there wasn't a conversation happening. There wasn't a meaningful discussion about this thing about the relative variation in food quality. So yeah, just to proceed forward with the history and not spend too much time on it, I started, as I began to learn these things and go home and practice them, it didn't take too long at all before I got to a point where I was making my living working 20 hours a week on the farm, and then had free time not only to take naps and play with my kids, but begin to blow my mouth off, go up and start giving workshops, which sort of evolved into courses. And then finally in 2010 evolved into an NGO, an educational organization called the Bionutrient Food Association, which I have subsequently been the executive director of. Our mission is increasing quality in the food supply, and by quality we're talking about flavor, aroma, nutritive value, health-giving attribute, not aesthetic or uniformity, but some of those more visceral, intuitive aspects of quality. So I'm going to proceed forward to the slides, and I don't actually know how to proceed forward to slides. There we go, technology. Where do I push the button? Okay, so the BFA, a 14-year-old organization with a mission to increase quality in the food supply. I think I said that. From 2010 to 2016, our work initially was education. We did courses, conferences, workshops, established local chapters. You can see a few headshots there of people who have spoken at our annual conference, the Soil and Nutrition Conference. We actually have the 11th iteration of that going on currently. We just did a 2-hour session last night with John Kempf, which was quite exciting. But as the sort of work spread through grassroots from, word of mouth, would do a course here, and someone attends from somewhere over there and says, hey, will you come do a course here? It sort of started to spread from the Northeast U.S. across the country and into other countries and into other continents. And it sure looked like these principles of working with nature, effectively, microbes evolved plants to feed them about 420 million years ago. People know this story? Evolutionary biology? The microbes evolved the plants. Yeah? People know about that? They also evolved the animals, right? Like 90+% of the cells in your body are not human, right? We have these identity conversations about who we are and, what color and gender and all that kind of stuff. I'm not sure if it happens here. There's a lot of it going on in the States. I'd say the first mistake is identifying as a human. If 90% of the cells in your body are not animal cells, then perhaps we really do need to have an identity conversation about what we actually are. I would suggest we're ecosystems. At any rate, the basic point about farming well is that you need to understand that it's about the bottom of the food chain. The vast majority of life is the microbes, and so only when you create a dynamic where they function well should you expect things to flourish. And so we were getting this response. Didn't matter what the scale was, you know, backyard garden or 2,000-acre farm. Didn't matter if it was corn or apples or echinacea. Didn't matter if it was a cold climate, a wet climate, sandy soil, clay soil. Didn't matter the gender or the age or the cultural dynamic of the human. It seemed across the board, wherever we were working, when you create a dynamic where the bottom of the food chain functions more well, the whole thing functions more well. And so, we had this sort of insight. Wouldn't it be exciting if it really is true that through working with life, we can create a dynamic where the ecosystem becomes much more healthy, and the farm viability increases dramatically, and the human health implications are quite positive? Wouldn't it be exciting if we could figure out a way to bring this to a larger scale? What would be the way to accomplish that? And the basic insight was that there's this thing called money, which seems to have a very important effect on the world. And if we could figure out a way to align economic interest with ecological interest and health interest, maybe we could, we could have a viable path. So we started our research work in it was 2016 when we laid out the conceptual framework, but the actual work began in 2017. We had three basic questions that we thought we needed to answer in the affirmative before we could plausibly say this could be a viable disruptor of agriculture. The three questions were: A, do nutrient variations exist in food, and are they significant? We'll call that one question. Second question was, if we do find significant nutrient variations in food, do they connect to soil type, variety, individual practice, or something more like soil health? And then the third question was, is it possible to build handheld, consumer-priced, non-invasive, flash of light gizmos where you could actually functionally flash a light at 3 different bags of carrots in the grocery store shelf, boop, boop, and 20 out of 100, boop, boop, 40 out of 100, boop, boop, 80 out of 100. Because if that was possible, if nutrient variations are dramatic, and they do connect to soil health, and you could build handheld instruments that anyone could use to discern relative quality, our thesis is that people would begin to take the 80s off the shelf and leave the 20s. And through that visceral economic incentive, the supply chain would be, motivated to focus on nutrition as opposed to volume, which is effectively where we stand currently in the dominant dynamic. We basically, I'll walk you through the steps here. We started in 2017. We built our first handheld meter. 2018, we built our first lab and tested our first couple of crops, carrots and spinach. We had people send in samples from across the country. This was just the U.S. at that point in time. Grocery stores, farmers markets, farms, gardens, organic, not organic, Michigan, Maine, Minnesota, Missouri. We wanted to survey the supply chain. And that year, it was just the bottom left there, the nutrients. Obviously not protein, but that was grain only. 2019, we set up our second lab at Chico State in California. And that year, we began to look at not just the nutrients in the food, but we had farmers send in the soil those crops grew in. So you pulled your 3 carrots, because you can do triplicate samples, because we're going to be scientists and get sort of that kind of thing going. When you pull your 3 carrots from the bed, you also want to take the top 10 centimeters of soil and the next 10 centimeters of soil, so we can assess the soil as it was related to the crop that was grown there. And then also we had a number of management questions, like what was the variety, where did you source it, when did you plant, how did you prepare the soil, did you cover crop, how did you terminate it, what was your fertility program, all kinds of sort of environmental conditions metadata. 2020, this is the graphic here. You can see we set up our third lab in Europe. It was in France. And you can see on the right-hand side the number of samples of each crop that were assessed. You can see all those green dots are farms. So it was a couple hundred farms that were part of the project. That was just 2020's data year. We've done this for 5 years in a row. And the oranges were citizen scientists, people going to grocery stores and farmers markets and buying things and sending them into the lab. So yeah, so what I want to focus on first is some of the things we found as we go through this process here. So yeah, the next, I think it's 4 slides we're going to look at here are just carrots, because we did about 25 or 30 different crops, depending on how you count whether 100 samples is enough to count or only 25. I think we did a few crops we did 25 samples of, so does that count or not? Not a big enough data set, but 21 crops we have good graphs for like this. So I've got a couple of mineral graphs, then I've got a couple of compound graphs, then we'll talk about the management practices. But understand, for anybody who wants to, we have a very big pile of data. I think we have almost 10,000 crop samples, almost 8,000 soil samples over 5 years, multiple continents, hundreds of farms. So I'm just giving you a snapshot of that with one crop and some of the data points. So here we have sulfur in carrots. On the left, you can see on the on the vertical axis, you can see 0, 20, 40, and then 60s on top. So for anybody who knows how to read sort of graphs, that tells you how many samples. So each of those bars, like the first one on the left probably is like 3 or 4. The second one is maybe 18 samples or in that range. Okay, so that's the bar graph. On the bottom left, you see 8.41, and the bottom right says 33.19, and that is sulfur milligrams per 100 grams of fresh weight. So the left carrot there, 8.41 milligrams of sulfur per 100 grams of fresh weight. On the right, 33.19. If you were to do the math, that would basically tell you that the carrot on the right had 4 times as much sulfur as the one on the left. So that would be what we would call a 4x variation. You'd have to eat 4 of these carrots to get as much sulfur as if you ate 1 of those carrots. That's the first point. The second point is, if you look at the graph, look at the shape of the graph, it's got a peak that's over towards the left. So you can see the fifths of the range. The red is the first fifth, the orange is the second fifth, the yellow is the third fifth. So that's basically 0 to 20 out of 100, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, and 80 to 100. So if you can divide the range of sulfur out, the bottom 20% is the red, the next 20% is the orange, next 20% is the yellow. So you can see that the vast majority of the sample we found is below the 50th percentile. Right? See how that goes down, significantly in the middle of the yellow? That's actually 50 out of 100. So almost all the carrots we found have less than half of what's possible. And the peak of the graph is in the 25th percentile. Does that make sense to people? So in shorthand, we'd say most carrots are relatively low.
So what's with sulfur?
We looked at a number of different nutrients, some elements and some compounds, and we prioritized nutrients that are generally understood to be deficient in the average, I think we used American body. So as far as humans are concerned, you don't have enough of these things in your system for all of your biochemical operations to occur. It was just individual elements. This is not overall quality. Yeah. The one on the right, phosphorus, 11.7 to 93, I think it is, point something, 69. That's an 8x variation. Again, you can see the peak of the graph is between the, probably on the 25th percentile. Right. I like to say if you went to college, I went to college, and if you got a 59 as your final exam, final grade out of 100, you'd be a failure. Anybody? Right. When I went to college, it was 90 and above was an A, 80 to 89 was a B, 70 to 79 was a C, 60 to 69 was a D, anything below 60 is an F. So the reds, the oranges, and the yellows are all F. Right? The light green is D's and C's, and the greens is B's and A's. So we got a bunch of failures here in class. This is the nature of the supply chain. People get that? Effectively. On the left, antioxidants. Antioxidants are understood to be very health beneficial. They are, anti-cancer, anti-diabetes, sort of, just overall good things to have in your food. The left is 4.92. The right is 195.05. That is a 40x variation. You'd have to eat 40 of the carrots on the left to get as many antioxidants as if you ate one of the carrots on the right. That is not a small variation. Right? That is a dramatic variation. It's not 2%, it's not 4%, it's not 8%. It's 40x. On the right, we've got polyphenols, 2.34 to I think it is 49.75. That's a more than 20x variation. You can see that the peak of the graph is in the 10th percentile. Right? There's a bunch of carrots we sampled, and I mean, not even many of them made it to the 40th percentile. So this is the nature of the supply chain we identified over multiple continents, over multiple years, and now we're going to look at the environmental conditions. And this is where, if you don't have a healthy dose of humility, hopefully you will soon get one. So the first question is, what is the effect of variety of genetics on nutrient levels? We got Napoli, Bolero, Nantes, Mokum, Romance. These are different varieties. You can see some of the Napolis are in the red, some are in the orange, some are in the yellow, some in the light green. So it's not like Napoli is going to produce a certain quality of carrot. What we see here, it sure looks like, is you can plant Napoli in this soil and get a relatively low level of nutrients, and you can plant it in that soil and get a relatively high level of nutrients. Similar with Bolero, similar with Nantes, similar with Mokum. I don't see any connection between genetics and nutrient levels. Now, this is not any individual nutrient. This is called BQI score, which is our stand-in for nutrient density. Bionutrient quotient index, I think is what it stands for, which is basically an average of 6 elements in 2 compound families. All right. Again, we have data like this for more than 20 crops: roots, leaves, fruits, and grains, oats and wheat, and potatoes and beets, and Swiss chard and mustard and spinach and pears and blueberries, like almost 2 dozen crops. We got good data sets like this. I have a hard time seeing the screen with the angle. Okay, on the right-hand side, by climate region. So this is USDA climate regions. We've got northeast, east, north, central, southeast, central, northwest. Some people say, well, it's your soil type that matters, or it's your climate zone that matters. I've got good soil. I've got bad soil. I've got a clay soil, therefore I can do a good job. I've got loam, that's the best thing. I've got rocky soil, that's a horrible soil. It's too cold here, it's too rainy here, it's too hot here. What I see is you can do a bad job anywhere, and you can do a good job anywhere. Like, I don't think it actually is like, oh, woe is us, I've got bad soil. What it looks like is, you can take what you've got and do well with it, or you can take what you've got and do poorly with it. All right. Oops. I pressed it twice. Sorry. How do you go back? Back button? Okay. By sample source on the left. We got farm, store, garden, farmer's market. In some circles, people are like, it's all about local. It's all about buy direct. It's, grow your own. I see a bunch of reds and not too many dark greens on the direct from the farm. That would be your CSA bag, your box scheme. In the grocery store, I see a bunch of reds and a couple of dark greens. That would be going to your Waitrose or your big box. I don't see any dramatic variation. These things are called violin plots. So where it's fattest is where the preponderance of the sample source is. And if you look at the store, it's a little bit fatter over to the right of where the farm is. So that's an uncomfortable fact for anybody who's in favor of small local agriculture. The garden here is next. Grow your own. That'll always be better than the grocery store. I don't see any dark greens in the garden. And finally, the farmer's market at the bottom. Buy local, go eat fresh. Effectively, what I'm seeing here is that most of us are not doing a very good job. Right? The relative nature of the supply chain is quite poor in relation to what it could be, and nowhere can you actually find superior quality per se. Okay, so finally on the right, you got certified organic on top. So you got a bunch of reds, more oranges, a lot of yellows, few light greens, a couple dark greens. People who use cover crops is next. One dark green, a lot more reds. No-till, there's 3 dark greens. Maybe it's basically same. Tillage is right there next. There's tillage right below no-till. Like, doesn't look dramatically different to me. Organic, not certified is the next one. That would be your small local producer. And then the really uncomfortable fact is reference and none. Those would be organic. Those would be non-organic grocery store. Like, we know nothing else except that it was a carrot. That was the citizen scientists going to grocery stores, and those bulbs are farther to the right than they are in some of the other ones there. Next one, extremely uncomfortable, regenerative. Right underneath none is regenerative. These are self-identified regenerative. This is 2021, 2019, so this is before we had certifications, but these are people identifying as regenerative producers. After that is biodynamic. Then we have local, greenhouse, light tillage, and heavy tillage. So what I want to say here is we've really looked at all these different ways that people choose to identify. And again, back to the religion metaphor, I'm a Presbyterian, and we have the best connection to the divine. Well, I'm a Methodist, and we know we are better. I would suggest, it doesn't so much matter which building you go to. It has much more to do with what your process is, what your direct relationship is. Right? You can have Presbyterians who have a deep, meaningful connection with the divine, and Presbyterians which are hypocrites. Right? So just because you're certified organic, just because you're local, just because you're regenerative, just because you're from the grocery store, this should not, by definition, imply that you are one thing or another. If we're looking at nutrition as an inherent aspect, we're not really finding differentiation. I'm sorry I don't have the graphic here, but the only thing that we found that correlated with increased nutrient levels was levels of life in the soil. It was respiration. Specifically, that was the only metric we were looking at in our first few years of work. We didn't have a lot of money, so the microbiome assessment was a simple respiration test. Of all the things we've looked at, many different factors, the only thing that correlated with increased nutrients in the food was levels of life in the soil, which actually makes a lot of sense. As I said before, it was the microbes who evolved the plants. The green leaf is there to make sugar, which to a large degree is used to feed the microbes, which are nature's fertilizer factory, right? That's the way it works, is the microbes are fed by the plant, they digest the soil, and then feed the plant. A lot of us in this community know that now. 10 years ago, that was a bit of a heretical statement, but I think at this point, many people understand those facts. And so it does actually make sense that just because you're certified organic does not necessarily mean you have high levels of soil life. Just because you're not certified organic does not mean you don't have high levels of soil life. It's a double negative. Like, you can have people who are not organic doing a good job on the soil. In fact, some large farmers are actually good farmers. Some non-organic farmers actually are good farmers and are doing a good job. Like, maybe they are so large because they're successful and they actually are nuanced and do a good job, right? Maybe some Muslims actually have a deep relationship with the divine, right? Just because they're not us doesn't mean they're not good. So I think we really need to be thinking deeply about this identity in us, them, and bifurcations. I think that we have some real opportunities here for how we frame this conversation. So just moving on, because I want to have time for Q&A. So basically, by 2021, we had collected enough data to effectively confidently answer our questions, our 3 questions in the affirmative. Yes, there is dramatic nutrient variation in the food supply. We didn't look at animal products. We only looked at plant materials, roots, leaves, fruits, and grains. Didn't look at medicinal plants. We only looked at sort of general crops. variation is dramatic. The only connection to variation we found was soil health. If we can use soil life as a corollary for soil health, because again, soil health is one of these terms which is not defined. Lots of conversation about what soil health is. For us, the metric we found that correlated was soil life. And finally, we were able to build calibrations for 10 of our crops, sufficient to release a meter, which I've got a version of right here, in the a few hundred of around the world. This is a very rudimentary piece of kit. It's 3D printed. It's got a little $100 chip inside. It's all open source. You can make one yourself if you want. It's got 10 LEDs in here, which is actually what's doing the science work. But and the way we did it was every one of those 10,000 crop samples that came into the lab, we flashed a light at with this first, took a picture of the spectral signature that bounced back, and then did the lab work to get the mineral levels and the compound levels, and then did the back calibrations with algorithms to find patterns. Right, that's where the AI comes in. And we did enough. The statistical significance was high enough. The R squared, 0.7 or 0.8 or whatever it was on the spectrum, to be able to release calibrations for 10 crops. So we could answer the third question. Yes, you can build handheld, consumer-priced, flash of light, non-invasive nutrient meters, ray guns. Open source was a piece for us too. This is all open source, which means the specs for how to build this is in the commons. We don't control it. It's not locked up. Anybody who wants to make one or make 100 or make 1,000 and sell them should feel free to. So we answered those three questions. Yes, this does look like a viable strategy to disrupt agriculture broadly. That was 2021. So at that point in time, we began our next step of the project, which was to attempt to define nutrient density in a crop. Because it's one thing to test polyphenols or copper or zinc, but a carrot is made up of much more. A cucumber is made up of much more than just these individual elements. There's actually tens of thousands of different nutrients in any piece of food. And so to attempt or to presume to empirically define 80 out of 100 or 20 out of 100 is a very complex process. And so it's going to be an expensive process. Again, we're a charitable NGO, and so we're not running on investment money. Everything's open source. So if it's going to be an expensive process, let's choose a crop that has a significant economic presence, and also our thought was a significant ecological presence. If our intention is to positively affect the environment, let's find something that has a significant ecological effect, and beef has the largest ecological effect of any crop. More acres of the planet are used in the production of cows than anything else. It also has the largest economic impact. There's more money spent on beef than any other crop. So our thesis was that there's a connection between what the cow eats and what's in the cow, and that how cows evolve to eat is better than what they're mostly being fed these days, which is this graphic here. The approach was to each farmer sent in us 3 steaks. I'm not sure if there's anybody from Pasture for Life here who was part of the process. One, beautiful, thank you very much. Yes, we had a couple hundred. Oh, one there, beautiful too. Pasture for Life was our partner here in the UK. That we had, I think, 10 farms who took part in this project. This is a global endeavor, 4 continents. Each farm sent in 3 steaks for each from 3 different animals, so triplicate samples again. We looked at elements, enzymes, vitamins, amino acids, fatty acids, proteins, lipids, polyphenols, terpenoids, hundreds of nutrients in each steak. Then they sent in the manure, and we looked at hundreds of bacteria species and hundreds of RKE. We wanted a really sophisticated microbiome assessment. And then they sent in the forage, and we did what are all the species and what are the nutrients in each species. And then we sent in the soil and what's all the dynamics of the soil. And then a whole complex series of management questions. How did you raise it? What was the variety? How old was it? How did you move them or not move them? And then we actually did some human health trials. So let's feed people grass-fed beef this week and test their urine and their blood and see what the inflammation marker responses are. And then next week we fed them the grain-fed beef and saw their body's response to that. And then finally we fed them actually some Impossible Burger to see what the effect of the thing that they call meat is on people's bodies. This is a process which is almost complete. This has been very expensive and time-consuming. We've collected all the data, and now we're in the process of feeding that back to scientists. We give the microbiologists the microbiome data and say, which animals do you think are most well and least well based on the microbiome? And then we give the biochemists the biochemistry data and say, based on the nutrient levels in this steak, which ones do you think are most appropriate for humans and least appropriate? Which has the highest level of inflammation markers and stress hormones, which has the best omega-3, omega-6 ratio? And then we give the nutritionists or the medical professionals the human data, and we say which people's bodies responded more well and least well to which, or people's bodies responded more well and least well to which food stuff. And then we give the agronomists the soil data and the forage and the fodder data and say which of these aspects looks like it was best for the animals and worst. And our hypothesis is that we're going to find patterns. The microbiologists will say these animals were most healthy and least healthy, and those will be the same ones that the biochemists say are best and worst, et cetera. And through that process, we hope to find some biomarkers, some basic nutrients at levels and ratios that correlate with 80 and 40 and 20 out of 100. That's the strategy. It's not our job to say what's best. It's our job to, as honestly as possible, use empiricism to assess nature and see what patterns are found. So that being said, so location of farms, you can see all over North America. There's actually a few more dots in Australia. There's only one dot in that map. All those ones in Europe there, those are all pasture for life farms. A couple from South America, Uruguay. Actually, there's more there from there as well. In the U.S., a lot of our grass-fed beef comes from Australia and Uruguay, just as far as the major supply chain is concerned. So omega-6, omega-3 is a ratio that people who are versed in this topic may have heard of. We're using it as a stand-in for our definition of nutrient density right now because we haven't completed this project yet. We hope to have it done by the end of the year. But we can see dramatic correlations between what the animals are fed and what's in their meat. Those ones that are on the top left, let's say truly grass-fed, those are coming from a big corporation which is buying meat from a place they didn't know where it came from, and they were told it was grass-fed meat, and it sure doesn't look like it is. This is a way we can actually use empiricism to discern the veracity of claims. The idea here is that it doesn't matter, again, whether you're Presbyterian or Methodist. It matters what your relationship to the divine is. It doesn't matter whether you've got a local label or a grass-fed label or an organic label. It matters what's in the meat. So we go from labels and claims and bifurcations to a continuum, an empirical continuum. This is sort of the phase shift, the reframing. So yeah, significant range of variation, right, which we would expect. Not everything is uniform, but we can see dramatically positive correlations there with, it seems, that having cows able to eat what cows evolved to eat from a human health outcome. Omega-6, omega-3 ratio correlates beautifully with inflammation in humans and chronic disease in humans, i.e. more omega-6, more inflammation, more cancer, diabetes, heart disease, osteoporosis, all that stuff. The diseases of the Western diet. And really nice correlations with diversity. Short answer, preliminary result, the greater the diversity of the species in the ecosystem that the cow has access to, the better the nutritional outcome for the animal. Yeah, as I said, this is still a work in process. It does look like the thesis, which is basically how nature set things up, is a good way, is being verified. This is a process which has taken us 3 years and over $1 million. Now that we actually know what we're doing, we think it'll be a 6 to 12 month process for any other future crop, and maybe only $250,000 to $300,000 per crop instead of $1 million. So our vision is that we proceed crop by crop. Wheat is next, and then we'll talk about milk or maybe apples. Whoever shows up with the cash probably has some decent amount of ability to say, how about you do this crop first or that crop first? if it's a little bit here, a little bit there, we're going to say wheat is next because we want to be looking at a grain, and then we want to, we'll proceed through crops. But if there's 50 crops that are generally eaten, and you say, times $250,000, you do the math. We're looking at north of 20 million, which is really not that much to potentially dramatically shift the way that food is engaged by humanity. So it's a work in process, and I hope I still have some time left for Q&A. I think that was my last slide. Yes, that's my last slide. So thank you all very much.
Wonderful. So if any of you have questions, please just raise your hands and I will bring the mic over. Fantastic data challenge and that, and amazing. So I'm sure there must be some interesting questions in the conversation.
Thank you. Is there any evidence to show that the minerals and all the goodies or the nutrient density of vegetables or meat sort of deteriorates over time more than others? Like, is storage important for these things?
So what effect does time have on nutrient values? Yeah, certainly, things like elements, copper and zinc and calcium and potassium do not degrade. They are in there when the carrot is harvested, and they're in there when the carrot rots. Other compounds, B12 and polyphenols, do break down over time. The degradation is affected by things like temperature and humidity. But I think the most important point to consider is that if you were to harvest a carrot that was at the 10th percentile of what it could be, 2 weeks later or a month later, it might be down to 8 or 6. But if you harvest a carrot that's at 90% of what it could be, 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 2 months or 4 months later, it may be only down to 60. So where you harvested at, it can only go down from there. And most of what we're harvesting is, as you saw initially, in the 20th or 25th percentile of what's possible. So certainly time is relative, has an effect. But the reality is most of what we're harvesting is nowhere close to what it could be to begin with. And so there's been a lot of research on post-harvest handling. The industry, universities have really dialed in how to keep things from degrading too much over time. The issue primarily, as far as I'm concerned, or at least a significant issue, is what was in there when you harvested it to begin with. And certainly if it's something like a tomato that you pick before it's ripe because you want to ship it, you're not going to have gotten in the full suite of nutrients, or a peach or things like that. So you're not going to have gotten those all in. But a thing like a carrot or a potato is going to be harvested effectively ripe. And then the issue of freshness is one perhaps somewhat less relevant. I'll tell you a big fat caveat here is this is all Western scientific chemistry, which is not food. Food is a much more subtle, nuanced, vibrational, harmonic thing, right? I mean, from the biodynamic perspective, they look at sensitive chromatography, and they look at that vibrational coherence of the thing. I mean, I would argue that probably is a very, very, very significant piece of the puzzle. And personally, if you were to ask me what I care about, I would say it's the vibration. But I made a strategic choice about 15 years ago to hide behind the physical plane and Western rational science, because if I started talking about coherence and vibration and consciousness and intention, perhaps people would not take me seriously. So, yes, I think that the essence of the thing, irradiation, in the supply chain, when you harvest something and then you have to, to have it go into Tesco's, you have to fry it, right? So it becomes safe. I would suggest that process of irradiation may not change the biochemistry much, but probably changes the vibration significantly. So I'm certainly in favor of fresh and local and lovingness and all that kind of stuff. But if we're going to be engaging on this Western rational scientific empirical framework, or presuming to at least be up to snuff on that framework, let's be humble about where we actually are. Yeah. Hi.
If we do get more of this data, we will get more confident that soil health is how we're getting more nutritious food, and we're all moving to growing that. How do you see it sort of panning out on on the labeling and the like, because if you're starting to make a lot of claims around nutritional value, are you moving food into the realms of what medicines have to do? It'd have to there's a whole there's a whole process of measuring a lot of batches to make sure that those claims are correct.
So I think I said at the beginning, my parents were involved in the organic movement from very early on, and helped write some of the first organic standards in the U.S. back in the mid-1980s. So I have a personal, almost 40-year experience, literally, of watching labeling and certification systems start from a grassroots, broad-minded impulse to getting to some sort of formalization, to then building momentum, to then industry wanting to get involved, to then government being involved, to bureaucracies, to backroom deals, to big things being watered down. And I personally, one of the foundational rationales behind the meter strategy is to obviate entirely certification and labeling. I'm envisioning a reality where certification and labeling are passé, are what people did in the olden days, that we're going to direct perception, that we're, instead of it being a binary, you are or are not local, you are or are not organic, you are or are not regenerative, the reality is, are you 20 out of 100 or 80 out of 100? And how do you discern that? I think it's entirely plausible. I mean, these kinds of things, right? These things used to be $10,000. Literally. Back when pointers came out, they were $10,000. DVD players, remember DVD players? I mean, they're passé. But when they first came out, they were $10,000. And then you could buy them for $10. So how about you've got a sensor in your phone? A decent number of people have phones, right? There's no reason one of those cameras could not be a spectrometer. So my vision is that we've got a dynamic where people are able to perceive directly in real time the essential nature of things, and all the labeling and marketing and QR codes and all that stuff is effectively, no longer relevant. Yeah, and what is it? I think I just saw something this morning on Google News. 2/3 of British teens' diets comes from what they call ultra-processed food. I would like to say, I mean, in the States we have this thing we call junk food, right? So that would be like saying living dead or night day. It's like man woman. It's like they're different things. Like alive is different than dead. Like junk is different than food. So let's call this junk and let's call that food. So if 2/3 of British teens' diets are coming from junk food, or ultra-processed food, that would be from junk. So I would unposit that all that stuff, that processed product, is even food to begin with, to some decent degree. Perhaps I'm a bit forceful on the point. I'm really talking about the essential food itself. And then there's the whole deeper conversation about, you start with high-quality wheat, or any kind of wheat, and you take the bran off of it, and then you have white flour, and then you mix some chemicals with it that cause it to rise really fast, and then you flash cook it, and within 15 minutes you go from flour to bread. Versus you take whole grain, you soak it, you grind it, you let it ferment for 2 or 3 days, and then you cook it. So sourdough is an entirely different bread, is an entirely different thing than white bread. Salami, right, in the olden days was a curing, microbial pre-digestion process. A salami was a wonderful thing, good for you, versus the stuff they call salami now, which is full of chemicals. So, I mean, it rapidly brings us to many levels of complexity when we engage this conversation. So I would say we're just really opening these are opening salvos. Yeah.
Sorry, I just wondered if there was any data for growing under power lines for apples, whether it's a good idea or not.
How about within line of sight of a cell tower, or where's your closest 5G? Yeah, I think if we're going to be talking about vibrations and harmonics and things like that, which I think is how nature communicates through vibration, we are propagating an immense amount of dissonant frequencies into the environment, which I would be extremely surprised if it doesn't have a really meaningful effect on our plants. Yeah, there's layers of conversation we can have here, but as much harmoniousness as we can be taking responsibility for in our environment, I think that's going to have overall beneficial effects on the living system. You can do a much better job under power lines, or a much worse job under power lines. You can do, like, the thing is, you are where you are, and how well can you do with where you are? I personally would not choose to purchase a farm under power lines if I was given a choice. Yeah. No.
Yeah, thank you so much for the fascinating statistics you have collected. I always thought it's impossible to measure, nutrient density because, as you said, there's so much factors can affect, and timing to collect the vegetables or location, type of soil, So you already talk about it, and to me I appreciate all the hard evidence you collected. But me as a statistician, I fully understand the danger of setting up a new global standard because, first of all, so much variation can affect, the data you collect, and also I fully appreciate you want to disconnect, like people blindly believe into like type of the labels, which definitely makes sense. I feel it's more healthy to think about as awareness of nutrient density, like what we eat, what we produce as farmers, rather than move to a new technology which is try really hard to measure the vegetables we grow as almost like judgment. And it's pretty dangerous to me in a way, but I really appreciate such a technology should exist to help us to regulate, or I don't know whether you understand what I meant. Because also the other point I want to say is a superfood may not be good for us anyway. Like you mentioned, traditionally we may have more variety of diet, which is low nutrient produced by local farmers, but then we have various options of different diet to balance as a human. But now if we all produce superfood to meet the industry standard, is it actually okay just eat 1 carrot a day and we're healthy enough? So yeah, I find this is quite a lot more to discover and to discuss. I really enjoyed your presentation, by the way. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I would say there's a couple of theses here, and one of the central ones is that nature figured this thing out a long time ago. And we have a culture that seems to give a lot more credence to science than to traditional wisdom and common sense. It sure looks like we were actually, each of us have very sophisticated nutrient monitoring systems inbuilt, right? The most sophisticated nutrient sensor you'll ever get, you carry around with you every day. Right up here in the olfactory section of your body, your nose and your tongue are actually extremely sophisticated nutrient monitoring systems, if you want to frame it that way. I think something like 30% of your DNA is associated with the function of your nose and your tongue. Nature thinks it's really important for you to be able to discern whether this carrot tastes good or not, whether this tomato tastes good or not. And what we're finding, thank you for bringing this up, I'm sorry I didn't bring it into the presentation yet, is that those things we call flavor correlate directly with nutrition. They may be just two sides of the same coin, different framings of the same thing. And so if we, for me, the question is how do you drive attention to this, I think, systemic issue, which is that a lot of what we call food these days is relatively devoid of flavor, and all kinds of synthetic products are added to it to trick our senses. So, yeah, I'm actually a very much of a Luddite. I barely know how to use a computer. I don't engage in social media. I don't engage in online economic transactions. I don't, there's a lot of things I don't do. So it's a bit of a question why it is that I'm pushing this envelope of sophisticated ray guns. I guess within the the creative tension, there may be some insight. It's very dangerous, yes, to try to technologically name and identify these things. So yeah, a lot of creative tension there. But I would say foundationally, hopefully, the science is guiding us towards that which our forebears knew for millennia, and it seems that that is actually the case. That our traditional ways of being, if you look at how humans engaged the landscape for millennia as caretakers, they were doing a brilliant job with polycultures and with no beasts of burden and no plows. And I mean, when the white man first came to North America, the North Americans were a head taller, literally a head taller, right? The Europeans came and rode their horses through these beautiful parks and said, "Oh my God, this is the Garden of Eden." And no, it was actually a very thoughtfully, completely managed ecosystem. It seems we actually already do know and have known for a very long time how to work most well, and we know how, lactic fermentation. I'm familiar with the Weston Price work. Kefir and yogurt are more bioavailable forms of dairy than raw milk. That sauerkraut is a much more beneficial for you than cabbage. That sourdough is better for you than white bread. That the traditional ways, from an empirical standpoint, from an empirical lens, prove themselves to be superior to the ways that industry is doing things now. So I would say I do have an agenda. Maybe from what I understand in literature, it sure looks like we can use science as, I like to call it hiding behind science. Because science is a lingua franca, because science is understood and approved and considered to be legitimate, if we use the scientific language to interrogate reality, it's a way of coming back to those insights that have been proven around the planet for a very long time. Yeah.
I didn't get what you had said about the Impossible Burger, where that fell in terms of the results.
It's higher levels of inflammation occurred in the people's urine and blood after eating it than the grass-fed burger, or actually the grain-fed meat. So inflammation being your body's response to things that it doesn't like. Yeah. I didn't actually say it.
Hey there. First off, Dan, thanks for coming to Humble Go Falkland. It's great to see you here in Scotland. But I just want to go back to the correlation between the microbiome in the soil, the living organisms in the soil, directly proportionate to the nutrient density of the food. And you used a respiration test from the soil.
Yes.
I'm just, because we do a lot on our farm with the microbiome in the soil as well, but we use shadowing microscopy. And I'm just curious as to why you chose, as a cost-effective method to do it, the respiration of the soil over the shadowing microscopy, or did you do both?
I'd actually never even heard of shadowing microscopy. We were basically envisioning this global survey of the dynamics, and we wanted to see if we could figure out a way that would be less than $100 to do 6 soil samples and 3 crop samples. And so we tried. It was really about how can we most economically collect the most information, and we were shooting from the hip in 2016. So I don't think we necessarily had all the best information. We assumed we didn't have much money. We wanted this to be something that could be done on all continents at the lowest possible price point. So it was just how do we collect data from multiple data points, management data, all kinds of soil metrics, all kinds of nutrient levels. And this was really just to answer some basic questions like, does variation exist and how significant is it? And where should we be looking for the things that seem to be most important? And it sure looks like microbiome is a key piece of where we need to be looking. So I would say, as science is always an evolving and iterative process, I would not recommend you repeat what we did. I would say let's begin to look more deeply into the microbiome component and interrogate what are the multiple modes of assessment. And if we can collectively begin to determine, what are some inexpensive ways that can be used by people globally to assess that and turn that into relevant and practical, guidance. This is all about, like, one thing is understanding, which is, maybe a sort of a mental process, a sort of a theoretical process. But the real point is, how do you take these understandings and use them to relative, to practical import? How do you convert insight into practice? And so that's really the work here, is to be able to convert these understandings into guidance that farmers can use to do a better job. Our objective is not to embarrass anyone. Our objective is to empower people to succeed. So on one side, the farmers can be, supported in doing a better job. On the other side, the purchasers can be supported in choosing what to purchase. And again, this is all about the economic strategy, the money strategy. Money has a very powerful impact on the world. Let's just be honest about that. Let's deal with that. Let's not say we agree or disagree. We think it's right or wrong, should or shouldn't. Capitalism started here or started where. It doesn't really matter. Reality is we're dealing with an economic reality. And so how do we use that to empower everyone to do a better job? Yeah.
Sorry, Togger. Just so when you're testing the respiratory in the soil, the 6 samples, roughly how long did it take you to get the results from those 6 samples that you did at once?
I think it was 12 and 24 hours. So we dried the soil, added a certain amount quotient of soil to a certain quotient of water, put it in a box, and then measured the carbon dioxide emitted after 12 and 24 hours for each of those 6 samples. Yeah.
Okay, we're at time, Dan,
At
and I
time.
think there's a load of more questions, so maybe you can complete and just say where people might be able to meet up with you, talk with you, etc.
I intend to be here through the day today and tomorrow. I look forward to talking to anyone who wants to talk to me. I think I'm on stage twice more. I don't actually know where or when, but they'll be in a panel format. So I run an NGO. Our website is bionutrient.org. Our science website is bionutrientinstitute.org. We have a YouTube page where we have collected all of the presentations from every single one of our conferences over the last more than 10 years. We've got our 2-day course, which I have been teaching around the world. All of this is on YouTube for free. If anybody drives tractor or otherwise is, doing things where their mind is not fully engaged and you want to look there, we have hundreds of hours of, I think, brilliant content freely available. And of course, there is that thing called social media, which I do not know how to sign on to or what the handles are. But if you look under Bionutrient, I think you can find some things, and feel free to engage us there. Perhaps one final thing. We are an NGO. We do run on donations. My vision is that the best way for us to fund this work would be for a number of people to put in their small tithe to the church. So call it $5 a month. You guys do pounds, £5 a month. If you find this inspiring and you would like to put your little bit in to the pot, we'd thoroughly appreciate it. You can do that as a recurring donation on our website. But thank you all very much.